Okay, so how do these categories of metaphysics relate to ethics? Well, first thing they relate to is questions of epistemology. So I've given you this term metaphysics, I'll give you this term epistemology, and epistemology is the science of knowing. How do we know what we think we know? And again, if you're familiar with this at all, there are enormous debates about this. These debates spill over, certainly into theological method. I think about 10 or 15 years ago in evangelical theology circles, with the beginnings of the emerging church and some other people along with some of those movements, there were huge debates about whether the correspondence theory of truth is really a viable theory, whether there are other theories of truth, how closely are certain kinds of evangelical theology tied to strong versions of the correspondence theory of truth that really don't make, that are really hard to sustain, and so on and so on. So these are live debates, very real debates. So when we talk about metaphysics, we talk about epistemology, how do we know things? And then when we've kind of worked through some of those questions, then we can ask, well, then how do we know what it means to live a good life, right? So I think the proper order of things, the proper way of thinking through things is this. Metaphysics, what is? Epistemology, how do we know what is? And then how do we apply that to how we ought to live? Okay, so, and the text mentions some of these things. And broadly speaking, a realist approach leads to some kind of correspondence view of truth. Now, a correspondence theory or view of truth can be a very basic and simple statement that what is true are statements that actually correspond to what is, right? So if I say, I'm looking out my window in my office at the law school right now as I'm narrating this lecture, and it's drizzling, it's raining, and if I say it is raining outside my window, that is a true statement if in fact that corresponds to the state of affairs outside my window. It is an untrue statement if in fact it's sunny outside and not raining. That's a very basic way of thinking about a correspondence view of truth. Non-realist approaches tend toward more of a coherence view of truth. So the notion here is that, I can make a statement like it is raining outside my window, and that statement might have a certain kind of meaning to it, but it can have all sorts of different sorts of shades of meaning. You can ask, well, when you say raining, can you be, how specific can you be about that? And it's also a statement of, for me, what I'm experiencing looking out my window. So for a coherence view, the idea is, well, how well we can kind of spend forever getting into how closely a human statement actually corresponds to some presumed real state of affairs, and we may never get to the end of that. And perhaps it's not even possible for human beings to get to the end of that. So really the best we can do is say, well, what you're saying, take a whole bunch of other assumptions about your ability to perceive what's going on outside your window, about the accuracy of those perceptions, about the use of language and terms like drizzle or rain and the shades of meaning, and so on. And it hangs together effectively, right? There are not huge gaps in how all of that hangs together. Whereas if I said, there is a space alien right now projecting on a huge screen out my window rain, but it really is not raining. It's just a projection by a space alien. Now, that obviously sounds crazy. It would be a crazy thing to say, because, in large part, it doesn't cohere with a lot of other stuff we know. We've never experienced space aliens before. They may not even exist. I came in, to work this morning. I drove my car. The rain fell on my head. You might be somewhere in the, southern New York, northern New Jersey kind of area, and you've experienced rain too. You can turn on the news, all these different things. It just doesn't fit together with everything else. That's broadly a coherence view. Now, as you can see again, right, I'm kind of giving you these buckets, I'm separating these things out. There are lots of ways to think all this through. Correspondence doesn't, do away with coherence as a valid notion, and coherence doesn't necessarily do away with correspondence, right? Realism doesn't necessarily mean a really naive kind of realism. It could include various shades of understanding, and it could very well recognize the vagaries of human language. I say it's raining outside my window right now. If I were a meteorologist, right, I might describe that in more scientific terms, and I could just talk about a percentage of humidity and a level of precipitation, right, and so we could get more and more and more specific. So I want you to see that these are useful ways of thinking. There are varieties of shades. It's not that you necessarily have to, firmly fight one against the other, although I do think ultimately you have to think through broadly what your positions are. Okay, how does this all relate then to ethical positions? Broadly speaking, a realist approach is going to lend itself to a couple of big categories of if you're approaching it from the perspective of universal ethics, of universal ethical thought. One is naturalism, and by naturalism, don't necessarily mean here a metaphysical naturalism. You could be a metaphysical theist, a Christian, or some other perspective that believes in a God that doesn't believe nature is all there is. But the idea here is that from the way things are, from how they're given to us, we can begin at least to discern some principles about how we ought to live, at least some high-level principles. And this is, a natural law kind of approach. So we can see that human beings simply are sociable creatures. We need to relate to each other, or we wither and die, literally. And given that we need to relate to each other, there's ways of relating to each other that help us flourish and experience, experience subjective things like joy, but also enable us to, build things and create culture and perpetuate the species and so on, right? And those suggest that there are some productive ways, what we'd say good ways of living, right? Another way of thinking about it is intuitionism. And so intuitionism will say that, it might not be easy or even possible to simply look at the world as it is given to us and to discern specific ethical principles from that. But we are constituted in such a way that we have an innate sense of ways of living that are better and worse, that are right and wrong. So it's something that comes a little more, naturalism means it comes a little more from outside observing. Intuitionism comes a little bit more from inside, based on how we're constructed. Now again, these aren't necessarily opposed to each other. They're broad approaches and perspectives. You might lean more toward one or the other, but there are plenty of ways in which you sort of can combine or relate these to each other. All right, non-realism. We might have two different broad categories. So one might be emotivism. And the idea behind emotivism, and some of this, flows out of some of the ideas of Immanuel Kant. Now Kant, I don't want to pigeonhole Kant. Kant's a very complex figure, but the influence, the legacy of Kant is really important and hard to overstate, right? So, but one of the things Kant did was to try to say, there are certain things we can know, and there are other categories of things that really are matters of emotion that aren't real. So it's different from intuitionism, because it's not like, Augustine would say we have intuitions from God, and those come from something real. And Kant's going to say, well, we have emotions and feelings, and those feelings have a certain kind of validity to them, but they're not necessarily tied to any kind of higher metaphysical reality. That's one way to look at it. We might say, very broadly speaking, risking a grave generalization, but probably fair. In our North American popular culture, at least, this is probably a pretty significant sort of approach, right? What you feel is right or wrong is something you need to honor for you, but it can't have any purchase for anybody else. That obviously is a non-realist account, and it doesn't necessarily lead to any kind of general principles that we can all live by unless we have some kind of agreement about what those might be. Another way to think about non-realism is logical positivism. So logical positivism was kind of a philosophical movement that really has lost a lot of its steam certainly in the academic philosophy literature. Probably by the 1960s or so, it was evident that logical positivism as a academic project really hadn't succeeded. But it remains really influential in our popular culture, I think, particularly in what we might call scientism. And by scientism, I mean the notion that scientific knowledge is the only kind of knowledge that counts. Now, I'm teaching a class next semester at ATS on theology and science. I think theology needs to interact fruitfully with mainstream natural sciences. I don't believe in the idea that there's a war between theology and mainstream science. There are, however, unfortunately in our popular culture, many voices within the scientific professional establishment, and also popular writers like, say, Richard Dawkins, who promote the idea that really all of this other kind of religion, emotion, all of these other things might be nice for some people, but they can't get at real truth. The only way to get at real truth, any kind of real truth, is through scientific work. And this flows directly from the idea of logical positivism, which says that the only thing human beings can really do is make logical, propositional statements that can be proven and demonstrated through formal principles of logic. That's the only kind of knowledge that really counts. Now, you might be surprised to have this under the bucket of non-realism. You might think, well, yeah, but scientists think they're describing the real world. I think that's largely true. I think most working scientists, and I think even people like Richard Dawkins, think that what they're talking about is the real world. I think they're actually just fundamentally confused about their epistemology, because the epistemology, the way of arguing and claiming what is actually true that they adopt, is actually logical positivism, which is not consistent with realism. Because the logical positivists said, we give up on metaphysics. We give up on trying to understand what is actually true, whether there is higher truth. We give up on that. As a pragmatic matter, all we can do is make logical statements. Logic may be a metaphysical reality, or it may not. We're just going to set that aside, and we're not even going to try to get at that. So it is fundamentally a non-realist approach. Now, again, if you look at both of these kinds of approaches, we're not necessarily going to dismiss them out of hand, even if we adopt a kind of metaphysical realism. Certainly, if you were taking any kind of natural law type approach, there's going to be, you're going to employ the tools of logic, right? Of course. If you're taking an intuitionist kind of approach, you're going to think carefully and look carefully at human emotion. But you're going to have a somewhat different view about how that all relates to ultimate things.